The world you see today, the borders, the flags, the nations, they look permanent, they look natural. But what if I told you none of this was meant to exist this way? What if the lines that divide countries today were never drawn for the people who live there? What if those lines were created in rooms, far away, by people who never even saw the land they were dividing? And what if the conflicts you see today, the tensions, the wars, the fear, are not new at all? What if they are simply echoes of decisions made long ago? Decisions that were never meant to last this long, but somehow still control the world today. So now ask yourself, if the world was divided long ago, why does it still matter today? And more importantly, what are we still living through without even realizing it? Before we go deeper into this story, tell me something. Where are you watching this video from? And what time is it right now in your city or country? The first lines were never for you. Long before the world was divided into the countries you recognize today, before passports, borders, and flags defined identity, the earth was not organized by straight lines on a map, but by something far more complex and human, something that moved, shifted, and evolved with time. People did not wake up thinking they belonged to a fixed nation. They belonged to land, to culture, to language, to tribes, to traditions that had been shaped over generations. The idea of a rigid border, a permanent division that could separate one group from another with a single line, was not how the world naturally existed. Instead, the world was alive. It was fluid. Communities expanded and shrank. Empires rose and fell, and influence spread not through clean divisions but through relationships, trade, alliances, and sometimes conflict. But even in conflict, there was a kind of understanding that the land was shared in ways that maps today fail to capture. People adapted to change because change was expected, and nothing was ever truly permanent. But then, slowly and almost quietly, a different kind of thinking began to take hold. It did not come from the people living on the land. It came from far away, from powerful centers of control where decisions were made not based on lived experience, but on strategy. These were places where land was no longer seen as something to live with, but something to own, to control, to divide. And this is where the story begins to shift in a way that would change everything. Because once land becomes something to control, it also becomes something to measure. And once it is measured, it can be drawn. And once it is drawn, it can be divided. At first, these divisions were not meant to define the future. They were tools, temporary solutions to immediate problems, ways for powerful groups to organize territories, manage influence, and avoid direct conflict with one another. But what made them dangerous was not how they were created, it was how simple they appeared. A line on a map looks harmless. It looks clean, logical, even necessary. But that simplicity hides a deeper reality, because a single line can cut through languages, through families, through cultures that had existed together long before anyone thought to divide them. A single line can take a living, breathing community and split it into two identities overnight, forcing people to choose sides that were never meant to exist. And the people drawing those lines often did not understand this, or worse, they understood it, but did not care. In distant rooms, far removed from the lands they were shaping, decisions were made with ink and paper, with rulers and maps spread across tables. These were not moments of chaos. They were quiet, calculated, deliberate. Agreements were signed, territories were assigned, and boundaries were created not based on what was right or fair, but on what was useful for those in power. And the most dangerous part of all this was how permanent these temporary decisions became. What was meant to solve problems for a moment began to define generations. The lines stayed, the maps were printed, taught, and accepted. Children grew up learning that these borders were natural, that this was how the world had always been, even though just a short time before, none of it existed in this form. Over time, these lines did something even more powerful than divide land. They began to shape identity itself. People started to see themselves not just as part of a culture or a community, but as part of a nation defined by those very borders. Loyalty shifted, belonging changed, and slowly, almost without anyone realizing it, the world began to think in terms of separation rather than connection. But beneath the surface, the reality never fully disappeared. The histories, the cultures, the shared pasts that had once existed without borders did not simply vanish because a line was drawn. They remained, hidden but alive, carried in memories, traditions, and identities that refused to fit neatly into the boxes created for them. And this is where tension began to grow, because when reality does not match the lines drawn on a map, something eventually has to give. At first, these tensions were small, almost invisible, moments of discomfort, misunderstandings, quiet resistance. But as time moved forward, those small tensions began to build, layer upon layer, generation after generation, until they became something much larger, something that could not stay hidden forever. Because a divided world does not remain silent. It remembers, it reacts. It pushes back in ways that are not always immediate, but are always inevitable. And so, what started as simple lines drawn in distant rooms slowly transformed into something far more powerful, something that would shape conflicts, define relationships between nations, and influence the course of history in ways that no one at the time could have fully predicted. The world did not just become divided once. It became divided again and again, each time reinforcing the idea that these lines were real, that they mattered, that they defined everything. But deep down, the truth remained unchanged. Those lines were never meant for the people who lived within them. They were never designed to carry the weight of identity, history, and belonging. And yet, today, they do. And as the years passed, the consequences of those early decisions began to unfold in ways that were impossible to ignore, as regions that had once been connected found themselves pulled apart, as communities that had shared histories were forced into separate futures, and as the world slowly moved toward a reality where division was no longer an exception, but the rule. And just when it seemed like these divisions had settled into something permanent, something unchangeable, the world entered a moment where everything would be tested again, where those invisible tensions would begin to surface more clearly than ever before, where the true impact of those lines would finally reveal itself. When the lines began to break, and just when it seemed like these divisions had settled into something permanent, something unchangeable, the world entered a moment where everything would be tested again, where those invisible tensions would begin to surface more clearly than ever before, where the true impact of those lines would finally reveal itself. Not all at once, and not in one place, but across different parts of the world where the cracks in those carefully drawn borders began to show. At first, it looked like ordinary conflict, the kind history had seen many times before, disagreements between groups, struggles over land, power shifting from one side to another. But this time, something was different. Something deeper was happening beneath the surface, something that could not be solved simply by moving armies or signing new agreements. Because the problem was no longer just about who controlled the land. The problem was that the land itself had been divided in a way that did not reflect the reality of the people living on it. And when reality and structure do not match, pressure begins to build. In some regions, people who had once lived as part of a single cultural or social system suddenly found themselves separated by borders that turned neighbors into foreigners. Languages that once flowed freely across regions were now restricted by political boundaries. Traditions that had developed over centuries were interrupted, reshaped, or even suppressed in order to fit into the identity of newly formed nations. But identity is not something that can be forced. It cannot be rewritten overnight. And so, even as new flags were raised and new governments were established, something inside the people remained unchanged. They remembered who they were before the lines were drawn. They remembered connections that maps could not erase. And in that memory, there was a quiet resistance, a refusal to fully accept a reality that did not feel natural. At first, that resistance was subtle. It appeared in conversations, in cultural practices, in the way people continued to hold on to their shared histories, despite being told they now belonged to different sides. But over time, as generations passed, and the pressure of living within imposed boundaries increased, that resistance began to take on a different form. It became louder, more visible, more difficult to ignore, because the longer a system exists that does not align with human reality, the more unstable it becomes. And eventually, that instability begins to show. Conflicts started to emerge, not just between nations, but within them. Groups within the same borders began to question their place, their identity, their belonging. They began to ask why they were separated from people they once lived with, why their history no longer matched the map they were told to accept, why decisions made far away continued to define their everyday lives. And these questions did not always lead to peaceful answers. Because when identity is challenged, when belonging is disrupted, the response is rarely simple. It is emotional. It is complex. It is deeply rooted in history that cannot be easily forgotten or rewritten. And this is where the divisions that once seemed like distant decisions began to take on a much more immediate and powerful presence. They were no longer just lines on a map. They became fault lines, invisible at first, but always there, running beneath the surface of societies, waiting for the right moment to shift, to move, to break open. And when they did, the consequences were never small. Entire regions began to experience instability, cycles of tension that would rise and fall, but never fully disappear. Agreements were made, broken, and remade again, each time attempting to fix something that had been fundamentally misaligned from the very beginning. But the more the world tried to fix these divisions, using the same logic that created them, the more complicated the situation became. Because you cannot solve a problem rooted in artificial separation by simply redrawing the lines again. Yet, that is exactly what continued to happen. Borders were adjusted, territories were exchanged, new agreements were signed, but the core issue remained untouched. The people within those borders still carried histories that did not match their assigned identities. They still felt connections that crossed those lines. And as long as those realities existed, the tension could never fully disappear. At the same time, something else was happening, something that made these divisions even more powerful and more difficult to escape. The world was becoming more connected. Communication was increasing, ideas were spreading faster than ever before, and people were becoming more aware of histories, identities, and narratives beyond their immediate surroundings. And instead of resolving the divisions, this increased awareness often made them more visible, more defined, more emotionally charged. Because now, people were not just living within these boundaries. They were constantly reminded of them. They could see how others lived on the other side of the line. They could compare, question, and challenge the structures that defined their reality. And in doing so, they began to understand that the divisions they lived with were not inevitable, not natural, but constructed. And once people begin to see something as constructed, as created rather than given, they begin to question it. And when enough people begin to question something, it starts to lose its power. But here is where the story becomes even more complex. Because even as these divisions were being questioned, they were also being reinforced. Governments, institutions, and systems that had built their existence around these borders had a reason to maintain them, to protect them, to ensure that they remained stable. Because once the idea of fixed borders is challenged, the entire structure of power that depends on them begins to feel uncertain. And power does not easily give up control. So while people questioned the divisions, the systems around them worked to strengthen them. And this created a tension that continues to exist even today. A tension between what people feel and what systems enforce, between lived reality and imposed structure, between history as it was experienced and history as it was rewritten. This tension does not always lead to open conflict. Sometimes it remains quiet, existing beneath the surface, shaping decisions, influencing perspectives, guiding actions in ways that are not always obvious. But it is always there, always present, always waiting for moments where it can rise to the surface again. And that is why the divisions created long ago never truly disappeared. They did not fade with time. They did not lose relevance. Instead, they adapted. They evolved. They became part of the world itself, embedded in how nations interact, how conflicts arise, how alliances are formed, and how people understand their place in the global system. But as history continued to move forward, something else began to emerge, something that would push these divisions into an entirely new phase, something that would connect past decisions with present realities in a way that could no longer be ignored. Because the world was no longer just dealing with the consequences of old divisions. It was beginning to repeat them. New lines were being drawn. New boundaries were being created. And once again, decisions were being made that would shape the future in ways that seemed small in the moment, but would carry consequences far beyond what anyone could see at the time. And just as before, these decisions were not always made with the people in mind. They were made with power in mind, control, influence, strategy. And as these new divisions began to take form, they started to mirror the past in ways that felt almost familiar, as if the world had not fully learned from what had already happened, as if history was not just being remembered, but repeated. And this is where the story begins to shift once again, where the connection between past and present becomes impossible to ignore, where the patterns that once seemed distant start to feel immediate, where the question is no longer just about what happened long ago, but about what is still happening right now. History is not over, it is happening again. And just as before, these decisions were not always made with the people in mind. They were made with power in mind, with control, influence, and long-term strategy, shaping choices that seemed small in the moment, but would carry consequences far beyond what anyone could see at the time. And as these new divisions began to take form, they started to mirror the past in ways that felt almost familiar, as if the world had not fully learned from what had already happened, as if history was not just being remembered but repeated. And this is where the story begins to shift once again, where the connection between past and present becomes impossible to ignore, where the patterns that once seemed distant start to feel immediate, where the question is no longer just about what happened long ago, but about what is still happening right now. Because if you look closely at the world today, you will begin to notice something that most people overlook, something that hides in plain sight, something that feels normal simply because it has existed for so long. But once you recognize it, it becomes impossible to ignore. And that is the fact that the lines dividing the world have not stopped being drawn. They have simply changed their form. They have become more complex, more layered, more deeply embedded into systems that shape everyday life. The divisions that once existed only on maps now exist in economies, in political alliances, in cultural narratives, and even in the way information itself is controlled and shared. The world may appear more connected than ever before, but that connection often hides a deeper fragmentation, a reality where people are still separated, still categorized, still defined by structures that were built on the same logic that created the first divisions. And this is where the illusion becomes most powerful. Because the modern world gives the impression of unity, of progress, of moving beyond the past, yet at the same time it continues to operate within frameworks that were established long ago. Nations still act based on boundaries that were drawn without their people in mind. Conflicts still emerge in regions where divisions were imposed rather than formed naturally. Alliances still reflect interests that go beyond the visible surface of diplomacy. And if you follow these patterns closely, you begin to see that what we call modern problems are often extensions of historical decisions, decisions that were never fully resolved, only carried forward into new forms. Take a moment to consider how many conflicts today can be traced back to lines drawn decades or even centuries ago. How many tensions exist not because of recent events, but because of unresolved histories that continue to shape relationships between nations and communities. These are not isolated incidents. They are part of a larger pattern, a system that has repeated itself across different regions and different periods of time. But what makes this repetition so powerful is not just that it happens, but that it often goes unnoticed. Because history is rarely experienced as a continuous story. It is presented in fragments, separated into events, dates, and narratives that appear disconnected from one another. People learn about the past as something that has already ended, something that exists in books, in lessons, in distant memories, rather than something that continues to influence the present in real and immediate ways. And this separation between past and present creates a kind of blindness. A blindness that prevents people from seeing how closely the two are connected. Because when you believe that history is over, you stop looking for it in the world around you. You stop questioning the structures that shape your reality. You accept the world as it is, without asking how it came to be that way. And this is exactly what allows these patterns to continue, because the less people understand the origins of the divisions they live within, the more likely they are to accept them as natural, as necessary, as unchangeable. But the truth is far more complex. The truth is that the world you are living in today is not the result of a single moment in history. It is the result of countless decisions layered on top of each other, decisions that have shaped not only the physical boundaries of nations, but also the invisible boundaries that influence how people think, how they relate to one another, and how they understand their place in the world. And once you begin to see this, once you begin to recognize that these divisions are not fixed, not inevitable, but constructed, you also begin to see something else, something that changes the way you understand everything around you. You begin to see that what has been created can also be changed. But change is never simple, because the structures that maintain these divisions are deeply rooted, not just in political systems, but in economic interests, cultural identities, and historical narratives that have been reinforced over generations. These are not systems that can be easily undone, because they are supported by layers of belief, by institutions, by power structures that rely on their stability. And this creates a paradox. On one hand, the world is more aware than ever before, more informed, more connected, more capable of understanding the deeper causes behind its divisions. On the other hand, the very systems that allow for this awareness are also the ones that reinforce the divisions themselves. And so the world exists in a state of tension, a constant balancing act between understanding and action, between awareness and change, between recognizing the problem and finding a way to move beyond it. But even within this tension, there are moments where the pattern becomes visible, where the repetition becomes undeniable, where the connection between past and present becomes so clear that it forces a deeper question to emerge, a question that goes beyond history, A question that challenges the way we see the world itself. And that question is this: if the divisions we live with were created, if they were shaped by decisions made long ago, if they continue to be reinforced by systems that benefit from their existence, then what does it really mean to belong to a nation, to a border, to a line that was never meant to define us in the first place? And more importantly, what happens when enough people begin to ask that question? Because history does not only repeat itself through events, it repeats itself through patterns of thinking, through assumptions that go unchallenged, through systems that continue to operate simply because they have always existed. But once those patterns are questioned, once the assumptions begin to break, once people start to see beyond the surface of the world they have been given, something begins to shift. Not immediately, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, in ways that are not always visible at first. And that shift is where the next part of this story begins, where the focus moves from how the world was divided to how those divisions are maintained, protected, and sometimes even deepened in ways that are far more subtle than before, where the forces shaping the world operate not just through visible power, but through influence, perception, and control over how reality itself is understood. And as these forces continue to shape the modern world, the question is no longer just about the lines that divide us, but about the systems that keep those lines in place, the narratives that justify them, and the unseen mechanisms that ensure they continue to matter, even in a world that claims to be moving forward. The system that keeps the world divided. And as these forces continue to shape the modern world, the question is no longer just about the lines that divide us, but about the systems that keep those lines in place, the narratives that justify them, and the unseen mechanisms that ensure they continue to matter, even in a world that claims to be moving forward. Because the truth is, borders alone are not enough to divide the world. Lines on a map can separate land, but they cannot control how people think, how they feel, or how they see one another. For a division to truly last, for it to remain powerful across generations, it must go deeper than geography. It must become part of the way people understand reality itself. And that is exactly what happened. Over time, the divisions that were once physical became psychological. They moved from the ground into the mind, from maps into belief systems, from temporary arrangements into permanent truths that people began to accept without question. This transformation did not happen by accident. It was built carefully, layer by layer, through systems that were designed not just to manage populations, but to shape them. Education systems began to teach history in ways that reinforced national identity, often simplifying or reshaping complex pasts into clear, controlled narratives. Entire generations grew up learning a version of history that aligned with the borders they lived within, a version that made those borders feel justified, necessary, even inevitable. Media played its role as well, telling stories that defined who belonged and who did not, who was seen as familiar and who was seen as different, sometimes even as a threat. Over time, these repeated messages created patterns of perception, subtle but powerful, shaping how people viewed others across those invisible lines. And then there were political systems, structures built around the idea of nations as fixed entities, each with its own interests, its own priorities, its own boundaries that must be protected at all costs. These systems relied on the existence of divisions, because without them, their entire foundation would begin to weaken. And so, the divisions were not only maintained, they were reinforced, strengthened, repeated in different forms, across different levels of society, until they became something that felt natural, something that felt like it had always been there. But here is where the story becomes even more complex. Because the system that maintains these divisions does not always operate in obvious ways. It does not always announce itself. In fact, its greatest strength lies in how invisible it can be. Because when something feels normal, when it feels like the natural order of things, people stop questioning it. They stop looking deeper. They accept it as part of reality, even if that reality was constructed over time. And this is where control becomes most effective, not through force alone, but through acceptance, through the quiet shaping of perception, through the repetition of ideas until they feel like truth. But beneath that surface of acceptance, something else continues to exist, something that cannot be fully controlled: human experience. Because no matter how strong a system becomes, it cannot completely erase the reality of how people live, how they connect, how they understand one another beyond imposed divisions. And this creates a constant tension, a tension between what people are taught to believe and what they actually experience, a tension between the identity they are given and the identity they feel. And this tension does not disappear. It grows, it shifts, it finds new ways to express itself, sometimes through culture, sometimes through resistance, sometimes through moments of connection that cross the very boundaries that are meant to keep people apart. And when these moments happen, they reveal something important. They reveal that the divisions are not absolute, that they are maintained, not natural, that they exist because they are continuously reinforced, not because they are unchangeable. But recognizing this is only the beginning, because understanding the system does not mean escaping it. In fact, the more you understand it, the more you begin to see how deeply it is embedded into everyday life, into the way information is shared, into the way opinions are formed, into the way people are categorized, labeled, and positioned within the global structure. And this is where the system evolves once again. Because in the modern world, control is no longer limited to physical space or traditional institutions. It extends into something far more subtle: information, the way stories are told, the way narratives are shaped, the way certain perspectives are amplified while others are minimized or ignored. And this level of control is even more powerful than the one that came before, because it does not just define borders, it defines reality. It influences what people believe is true, what they believe is possible, and what they believe cannot be changed. And once reality itself is shaped, the divisions become even stronger, because people are no longer just living within them, they are thinking within them. And this is where the system reaches its most powerful form, not when it forces division, but when it no longer has to, when people begin to maintain those divisions themselves through their beliefs, their actions, their understanding of the world. But even at this level, the system is not perfect. It has limits, because no system, no matter how powerful, can fully control the complexity of human thought, the depth of human experience, or the unpredictability of how people respond when they begin to see beyond what they have been told. And throughout history, there have always been moments when people started to question, when they began to look beyond the surface, when they challenged the structures that defined their reality. These moments are not always large. They are not always dramatic. Sometimes they are quiet, individual realizations, a shift in perspective, a question that refuses to go away, a moment of clarity that changes how someone sees everything. And when enough of these moments begin to connect, when enough people start to question at the same time, something begins to happen. The system starts to feel pressure, not from outside, but from within. Because the more people understand how something works, the harder it becomes to maintain it in the same way. And this is where the story moves into its most critical phase. Because the world is not just divided by lines or maintained by systems. It is shaped by choices, by decisions made both at the highest levels of power and at the level of individual thought. And as awareness grows, as understanding deepens, those choices begin to change. Slowly, unevenly, but undeniably. And with that change comes a new possibility. A possibility that challenges everything that has come before. Because if the divisions were created, if they were maintained, if they were reinforced over time, then the future is not fixed. It is not locked into the patterns of the past. It is something that can be shaped. But shaping it requires something that has always been difficult. It requires seeing the world not just as it is presented, but as it truly is. It requires understanding not just the lines that divide us, but the systems that sustain those lines. And most importantly, it requires asking a question that goes beyond history, beyond politics, beyond the surface of the world we see every day. A question that brings everything together. A question that forces us to look not just at the past or the present, but at the future itself. Because once you understand how the world was divided, once you see how those divisions are maintained, once you recognize the patterns that continue to repeat, you are left with one unavoidable realization. The story is not finished. It is still being written, right now, in real time, through decisions that are being made, through systems that are evolving, through people who are beginning to see beyond what they were once told. And as this realization begins to spread, as more people start to question, to understand, to look deeper, the world reaches a point where something has to change, not because it is easy, not because it is planned, but because it becomes impossible to continue in the same way. And that is where the next part of this story begins. Not in the past, not in distant history, but in the present moment, where everything that has been built, everything that has been maintained, everything that has been accepted, starts to face its greatest challenge yet. The moment the world starts to question itself, where everything that has been built, everything that has been maintained, everything that has been accepted, starts to face its greatest challenge yet. Because there comes a moment in every long story, a moment that does not arrive suddenly, but builds slowly over time, where the weight of everything that has been created becomes impossible to ignore, where the systems that once felt stable begin to feel uncertain, where the structures that once seemed permanent begin to reveal their cracks. And that moment is not defined by a single event or a single place. It is defined by a shift in awareness, a change in how people begin to see the world around them. And that moment is not in the past. It is happening now. For a long time, the divisions that shaped the world remained largely unquestioned, not because people agreed with them completely, but because they were accepted as part of reality, as something that could not be changed, something too complex, too large, too deeply rooted to be challenged in any meaningful way. But over time, as generations changed and the world became more connected, something began to shift in a way that had never happened before. People started to see more. They started to understand more. They started to question more. Not just the visible conflicts, not just the immediate tensions, but the deeper causes behind them, the historical roots, the decisions that had shaped the present in ways that were never fully explained. And as this awareness began to spread, it created something powerful, something that could not be easily controlled or contained. It created perspective. Because when people begin to understand the origin of something, when they begin to see how it was built, how it was maintained, how it was reinforced over time, they also begin to realize that it is not fixed, that it is not unchangeable, that it exists because it has been allowed to exist. And this realization changes everything, because it shifts the focus from acceptance to possibility. It opens a space where questions begin to form, questions that challenge long-held assumptions, questions that go beyond what has been taught, questions that look for answers not just in official narratives, but in the deeper patterns of history and human experience. And these questions do not stay isolated. They connect, they spread, they grow. Across different parts of the world, in different societies, among different groups of people, the same realization begins to emerge, sometimes quietly, sometimes openly, but always with a sense that something is no longer as certain as it once seemed. And when enough people begin to feel that uncertainty, it creates a kind of pressure, not a destructive pressure, but a transformative one. A pressure that pushes against the structures that have remained unchanged for so long. But change, especially at this level, is never simple, because the systems that maintain these divisions are not passive. They are active. They respond. They adapt. They evolve in ways that allow them to continue functioning even as they are being questioned. And this is where the tension becomes most intense, because on one side, there is growing awareness, a deeper understanding of how the world came to be the way it is, a recognition that the divisions are not natural but constructed. And on the other side, there are systems that rely on those divisions, systems that continue to reinforce them through policies, narratives, and structures that shape everyday life. And between these two forces, the world enters a state of transition, a state where the old patterns are still present, still powerful, but no longer unquestioned. A state where new ideas are emerging, but have not yet fully taken shape. A state where the future is uncertain, not because it is empty, but because it is open. And within this openness, something remarkable begins to happen. People begin to connect in ways that go beyond the divisions they have inherited. They begin to see similarities where they were once taught to see differences. They begin to recognize shared experiences, shared struggles, shared hopes that exist across borders, across cultures, across identities that were once considered separate. And these connections, even when small, carry a powerful message. They show that the divisions are not absolute, that they can be crossed, that they can be redefined. But at the same time, the presence of these connections also reveals how strong the existing structures still are, because every attempt to move beyond division is met with resistance, sometimes subtle, sometimes direct, sometimes through systems that reinforce separation, sometimes through narratives that emphasize difference, sometimes through fear that discourages change. And this creates a delicate balance. A balance between movement and resistance, between possibility and limitation, between what could be and what still is. And it is within this balance that the future of the world begins to take shape, because the direction the world moves in from this point forward will not be determined by a single decision or a single event. It will be shaped by countless choices, by how individuals, communities, and nations respond to the awareness that is now emerging. Some will hold on to the old structures, seeking stability in what is familiar, even if it is flawed. Others will push for change, for new ways of thinking, for new ways of organizing the world that reflect a deeper understanding of history and human connection. And most will exist somewhere in between, navigating the complexity of a world that is no longer as certain as it once was. But no matter where people stand, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The world is at a turning point. Not a dramatic, sudden turning point that can be easily identified in history books, but a gradual, ongoing shift that is happening across different levels of society, across different regions, across different ways of thinking. A shift that is redefining how people understand identity, belonging, and connection. And this shift carries with it both opportunity and risk, because while it opens the possibility for a more connected, more understanding world, it also challenges the structures that have provided stability, even if that stability was built on division. And when stability is challenged, uncertainty follows. And when uncertainty follows, the response is not always predictable. Some will move toward greater openness. Others will retreat into stronger divisions. Some will seek to build bridges. Others will reinforce walls. And this is why the moment the world is in right now is so important, because it is not just a continuation of the past. It is a moment where the direction of the future is being shaped. A moment where the patterns of history can either be repeated once again or finally understood in a way that allows something new to emerge. And this brings us to a realization that cannot be ignored. The divisions that were created long ago are not just historical events. They are living realities. They exist in the present. They influence the future. And most importantly, they involve all of us. Because whether we realize it or not, we are part of this system. We live within it. We interact with it. We are shaped by it. But we also have the ability to question it, to understand it, to see beyond it. And that is where the true power lies. Not in the systems themselves, but in the awareness of those who live within them. Because once awareness reaches a certain point, once enough people begin to see the patterns, to understand the connections, to question the assumptions, the story cannot continue in the same way. It has to evolve. It has to change. And that change does not begin somewhere far away. It begins with a simple realization, a realization that brings everything together, a realization that connects the past, the present, and the future into a single continuous story, a story that is still being written. And as that realization begins to take hold, as it spreads, as it deepens, the world moves closer to its next chapter. A chapter that will not just explain what has happened or what is happening, but will begin to answer the most important question of all. What happens next? What happens next is not decided yet. What happens next? That question does not belong to the past. It does not belong to the people who drew the first lines, or the ones who reinforced them, or even the systems that continue to maintain them today. It belongs to this moment, to the present, to a world that stands between everything that has already been shaped and everything that has yet to be decided. Because for the first time in a very long time, the direction of the world is not being driven only by the same patterns that have repeated across generations. For the first time, there is a level of awareness that did not exist before, a level of connection that goes beyond borders, beyond systems, beyond the structures that once seemed impossible to question, and that changes everything. But change does not arrive as a single event. It does not announce itself clearly. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, in the way people start to think differently, in the way they begin to see connections where they once saw divisions, in the way they begin to question things that were once accepted without hesitation. And when these small shifts begin to multiply, when they start to spread across different places, different cultures, different societies, they begin to form something larger, something powerful, something that cannot be easily controlled, a collective awareness. And this awareness is what makes this moment different from every moment that came before it. Because in the past, divisions were created and maintained in a world where information was limited, where perspectives were controlled, where people often had no way of seeing beyond the boundaries they were given. But today, those boundaries are no longer as closed as they once were. People can see beyond them. They can understand histories that were never fully explained. They can connect with others across distances that once felt impossible. And in doing so, they begin to realize something that changes the entire structure of how the world operates. They begin to realize that the divisions are not as absolute as they appear, that the systems that maintain them are not as unbreakable as they seem, that the patterns that have repeated for so long are not inevitable. But realization alone is not enough, because awareness creates possibility, but it does not guarantee change. And this is where the world stands right now, at the edge of possibility, at the edge of something that could reshape everything or repeat everything once again. Because every system that exists today is built on layers of history, layers of decisions, layers of structures that have been reinforced over time. These systems do not disappear simply because they are understood. They adapt, they respond, they find ways to maintain themselves even in the face of change. And this is what makes this moment so uncertain, because the same awareness that has the potential to transform the world also creates tension within it. A tension between old structures and new perspectives, between established power and emerging understanding, between the comfort of what is known and the uncertainty of what could be. And within this tension, different paths begin to form, paths that lead in different directions. Some lead toward deeper division, toward stronger reinforcement of borders, identities, and systems that separate people. These paths are driven by fear, by the desire to hold on to what is familiar, even if it is flawed, even if it continues to create conflict and misunderstanding. Other paths lead toward connection, toward rethinking the structures that define the world, toward finding ways to move beyond the divisions that have shaped history for so long. These paths are driven by curiosity, by understanding, by the recognition that the world does not have to remain as it has been. And between these paths, the world moves forward, not in a straight line, not with a clear direction, but through a series of choices, decisions made at every level, from individuals to nations, from small actions to large policies, each one contributing to the shape of what comes next. And this is where the story becomes deeply personal, because it is easy to think of history as something distant, something that happens on a global scale, something that is controlled by leaders, by governments, by forces beyond individual influence. But the truth is more complex, because the systems that shape the world are not separate from the people within them. They are influenced by them, maintained by them, reinforced by them, and sometimes changed by them. Every belief that is accepted without question strengthens the existing structure. Every assumption that goes unchallenged allows patterns to continue. Every moment where division is seen as natural reinforces the idea that it cannot be changed. But at the same time, every question that is asked begins to create a shift. Every new perspective opens a possibility. Every connection that crosses a boundary weakens the idea that those boundaries are absolute. And when enough of these moments begin to connect, when enough people begin to see beyond what they were given, something begins to happen. Not immediately, not all at once, but gradually, inevitably, the system begins to feel pressure, not from outside forces alone, but from within itself. Because systems rely on consistency, they rely on patterns that repeat, they rely on people accepting them as reality. And when that acceptance begins to change, even slightly, even slowly, the entire structure becomes less stable, less predictable, more open to transformation. But transformation is never simple. It comes with uncertainty, with challenges, with moments where the direction forward is not clear. And this is where the future becomes something that cannot be easily defined. Because the world is not moving toward a single outcome. It is moving through a process that involves conflict, understanding, resistance, adaptation, and change happening all at once, in different ways, in different places. And this process is still unfolding, right now, in ways that are visible and invisible at the same time. Because while some changes are clear, seen in shifts in policies, in global relationships, in the way nations interact, others are far more subtle, happening within individuals, within communities, within the way people think and feel about the world around them. And these subtle changes are often the most important, because they shape the foundation upon which larger changes are built. They determine how people respond to challenges, how they interpret events, how they decide what matters and what does not. And as these internal shifts continue to grow, they begin to influence the external world in ways that are not always immediate, but are always significant. And this is why the question of what happens next cannot be answered with certainty. Because it depends on a balance between awareness and action, between understanding and implementation, between the recognition of patterns and the willingness to move beyond them. And this balance is not fixed. It changes, it evolves, it responds to the choices that are made every day in ways both large and small. And this is where the story reaches its most important realization. Because the future is not something that simply arrives. It is something that is created through decisions, through actions, through the way people choose to understand and respond to the world around them. And that means that the divisions created long ago do not have to define everything that comes next. They can continue, they can evolve, or they can be understood in a way that allows something different to emerge. But that possibility is not guaranteed. It requires something that has always been difficult. It requires awareness to turn into action. It requires understanding to move beyond observation. It requires people to not only see the patterns, but to choose how they respond to them. And that choice is what makes this moment so powerful. Because it is not controlled by a single force. It is shaped by many, by individuals, by communities, by nations, each one contributing to the direction the world moves in. And as all of these forces interact, as they influence one another, as they respond to the changing reality around them, the story continues, not as something that has already been written, but as something that is still unfolding, still evolving, still being shaped in real time. And as it moves forward, as it carries the weight of the past and the possibilities of the future, it brings everything to one final point of understanding, a point where the question is no longer just about what has happened, or even what is happening, but about what will be chosen. Because in the end, the most powerful force in shaping the world is not the lines that divide it, or the systems that maintain those divisions. It is the awareness of those who live within it, and the choices they make when they finally begin to see. The world you see is a choice, and the choices they make when they finally begin to see, that is where everything changes. Because for most of history, people did not realize they were part of something larger, something structured, something shaped long before they were born. They lived within systems that felt natural, unquestionable, permanent. The divisions around them were not seen as decisions, they were seen as reality itself. And when something feels like reality, it becomes almost impossible to challenge. But awareness changes that. Awareness creates a distance between what is and what is accepted. It creates a moment where a person can step back and ask a simple but powerful question. Is this the only way the world can exist? And once that question is asked, once it is felt deeply enough, it cannot be ignored. Because the world you see is not just something you observe, it is something you participate in. Every identity you accept, every boundary you believe in, every division you see as natural becomes part of the system that continues to shape reality. And this is where the story becomes more than history. It becomes personal. Because the divisions that were created long ago are not just held in maps or governments or institutions. They are held in minds, in perceptions, in the way people define themselves and others. And that means something very important. It means that the continuation of those divisions does not only depend on systems, it depends on people, on how they think, on how they see, on how they respond. And this realization is both powerful and unsettling, because it means that change is possible, but it also means that responsibility cannot be avoided. Because if the world continues in the same patterns, if the same divisions repeat, if the same conflicts emerge again and again, it is not only because of what was done in the past, it is also because of what is being accepted in the present. And this is where the story reaches its deepest point. Because it is easy to look at history and see it as something separate, something that happened to other people, in other times, under different circumstances. But the truth is that history does not stay in the past. It moves forward. It lives within the present. It shapes the future. And every moment is connected. Every decision, every belief, every action contributes to the direction the world moves in. And this is why the question of what happens next is so important. Because it is not a distant question. It is not something that will be answered in the future. It is something that is being answered right now, through choices that are made every day, through the way people respond to division, to conflict, to difference, through whether they choose to reinforce what has always existed or to see beyond it. And seeing beyond it does not mean ignoring reality. It does not mean pretending that divisions do not exist. It means understanding them, seeing where they come from, recognizing how they are maintained, and then deciding what they truly mean. Because meaning is not fixed, it is created. And when meaning changes, reality begins to change with it. But this kind of change is not easy. It requires something that goes against many of the patterns that have been built over time. It requires questioning what feels certain. It requires stepping outside of familiar ways of thinking. It requires the willingness to see the world not just as it has been presented, but as something more complex, more connected, more open than it might first appear. And this is where the future begins to take shape in a way that is different from the past. Because the past was shaped largely by decisions made by a limited number of people, decisions that affected many but were understood by few. But the present is different, because the ability to understand, to question, to see beyond what is given is no longer limited in the same way. And this creates a new kind of possibility, a possibility where the direction of the world is not determined only by power, but also by awareness, by how many people begin to see the patterns, by how deeply they understand them, by what they choose to do with that understanding. And this is where the story becomes something that is still unfinished. Because unlike the past, which has already been written, the future remains open. It is not fixed. It is not predetermined. It is shaped continuously, moment by moment, through the interaction of countless perspectives, choices, and actions. And within that openness, there is both uncertainty and opportunity. Uncertainty because there is no single path forward. Opportunity because that means change is possible. Real change. Not just in how the world looks on the surface, but in how it functions at a deeper level. But whether that change happens and what form it takes depends on something that cannot be controlled from a distance. It depends on awareness turning into action, on understanding becoming something that influences behavior, decisions, and the way people engage with the world around them. And this is where the story reaches its most important realization. Because after everything that has been explained, after understanding how the world was divided, how those divisions were maintained, how they continue to shape the present, there is one truth that remains. The world you see today is not just the result of the past. It is also the result of what is being accepted right now. And that means something powerful. It means that even though the lines were drawn long ago, even though the systems were built over generations, even though the patterns have repeated again and again, they are not unchangeable. They are not absolute. They exist because they continue to be part of how the world operates. And anything that operates can evolve. It can shift. It can transform. But only if it is understood. Only if it is seen clearly. And that brings everything back to you. To the person watching. To the one who has followed this story from the beginning. Because now you know something that many people never stop to think about. You know that the world is not as fixed as it appears. You know that the divisions around you have a history, a structure, a reason for existing. And most importantly, you know that the story is still being written. So the final question is not about the past. It is not about the people who drew the first lines. It is not about the systems that maintained them. The final question is about now, about this moment, about what comes next. Because the world you see is not just something you live in. It is something you help shape. Through what you believe, through what you question, through what you accept, and what you refuse to accept. And when enough people begin to see that, the story changes. Slowly, quietly, but permanently. Because, in the end, the most powerful force in history is not the line that divides the world. It is the moment people realize they don't have to see it the same way anymore. The world was divided long ago, but the story didn't end there. It continued through every generation, through every decision, through every moment that brought us to where we are today. And now, you are part of that story. So before you leave, tell me this. Where are you watching this from? And what time is it in your city or country right now? Because no matter where you are, no matter which side of the world you're on, you are living inside the same story. And maybe, for the first time, you're starting to see it.